Good evening everyone, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 9th August 2025 and today we have some very important topics from the Hindu newspaper. So one by one, we'll try to discuss all these important topics in a detailed and in-depth manner. And in fact, all these topics that we are going to discuss are very important for both prelims and mains examinations. So the first topic with which we are going to start this discussion is about the rain, landslides and flash floods, and in fact they're being called as an uncertain mix. And this article has been given in the Indian Express newspaper, and this is very important for General Studies paper 3 as well as General Studies paper 1 geography. So we all knew that recently in Uttarakhand we have seen a cloud burst and then flash floods also, and in fact it has led to the loss of lives and in fact the damage to the infrastructure. So let's understand the link between rain, landslides and flash floods and the plans which are needed to be put in place for the mitigation of any disaster which is associated with such events like rain, landslides and flash floods. And in last few classes we have discussed flash floods and cloud burst in a very detailed manner. So now let's understand the relation between rain, landslides and flash floods. So let's understand the context of this topic. The context is that recently we have seen flash floods in Uttakashi on August 5th, and in fact the flash floods have killed at least 5 people, and in fact many number of people are still missing, and therefore it has caused a widespread destruction in Uttarakhand. In fact it has also led to the loss of the property and the infrastructure as well. So therefore you have to understand the scale of such destruction which took place because of the cloud burst and associated flash floods. And in fact hundreds of people were displaced, and a similar extreme weather events in Himachal Pradesh last month also killed dozens of people and affected thousands. So therefore it is very important that we should understand the relation between rain, landslides, flash floods. Right, so let's understand the flash floods which took place in Darali, Uttakashi. So the cause is still unclear, so therefore it has been highlighting increasing or rising risks of such unpredictable weather events. So in fact if we talk about the flash floods that recently occurred, so most of us associated those flash floods to the cloud burst. Now what is a cloud burst? So cloud burst is a heavy or intense rainfall over a limited period. Right? So a particular region, intense and heavy rainfall for 1 hour is defined as a flash flood. Now defined as a cloud burst, right? So a flash floods often triggered by extreme rainfall that causes landslides, mudslides, and they also sweep debris into rivers, thereby destroying everything which comes in their path. However, the exact cause of flash floods that took place on August 5th, so it is still unknown, right? So it is still uncertain. And in fact, though a glacial lake breach is a possibility, but it is yet to be confirmed. We don't know whether it is a cloud burst, whether it is a glacial lake breach. So despite normal southwest monsoon, the incident has underscores the growing disaster risk in ecologically fragile regions. So here Western Ghats can be considered as ecologically fragile area. Himalayas are also considered as a ecologically fragile area. So therefore there has been an increasing difficulty of establishing effective early warning and mitigation systems. So if early warning and mitigation systems are put in place, so there is a possibility that we can reduce the number of number of deaths which being caused because of the flash floods, right? So the vulnerability can be substantially minimized through the early warning systems and the mitigation systems if we put them in place, right? So therefore, let's understand the rainfall pattern and cloudburst concerns in Uttarkashi. So despite such a heavy intense rainfall across Uttarakhand this month, so this Uttarkashi district experienced relatively less precipitation. And in fact, this less precipitation, there is a very minute possibility of triggering flash floods. So first thing. The second thing is that on August 3rd and 4th, Haridwar and Uddam Singh Nagar, so they have seen very heavy and intense rains. However, Uttarkashi received below normal rainfall. However, according to the Indian Meteorological Department's data, on August 5 of the flood day, Uttarkashi recorded just 32 millimeters of rain, double the daily normal, but far from an extreme rainfall event. So therefore, it is still uncertain what exactly triggered this flash flood, because the rainfall, even though it is 32 millimeters of rain, it is not intense or heavy rainfall that it could trigger a flash flood. And when we talk about the cloud burst, so I have already explained you the definition of a cloud burst. So cloud burst definition has been given by the Indian Meteorological Department, and it says that at least 100 millimeters of rain in about an hour over a 10 into 10 kilometers area, which is highly localized and which often go unrecorded if measuring instruments are absent in the affected zone. However, such intense and heavy short duration rainfall can actually trigger landslides and even flash floods also, as they were seen in Himachal Pradesh recently. However, with respect to this Uttarkashi flash flood incident, there is no evidence of any cloud burst or a cloud burst like event, even in the remote areas also. So therefore, what actually triggered this flash flood is remain unknown. So it is very important that we need to understand the exact reasons behind this flash flood. Only then the proper frameworks and plans can be put in place to reduce the vulnerability of such sudden events, so that the vulnerability can be significantly minimized through such systems. However, there are multiple triggers behind these flash floods, particularly in the Himalayan areas. So let's understand what are the major causes of flash floods in the Himalayan areas. Now, one thing that we should understand, Himalayas are ecologically fragile systems. And in fact, the flash floods in Himalayas are rarely caused by a single factor. So flash floods in Himalayas are a combination of multiple factors. And even a cloud burst or a heavy rainfall not directly result in a sudden flash flood like a event. And in fact, such events typically require combination of conditions, such as intense and heavy rainfall that leads to the landslides, mudslides, and these landslides and mudslides gradually channel the debris into rivers, steep slopes, and that facilitate the rapid water flow and sudden glacial breaks. So therefore, it actually releases a large volumes of water, as seen in Chamoli in Himachal Pradesh in 2021. So however, in fragile terrains, particularly the Himalayan terrains with eroding slopes, and these slopes are also very steep, right? So these slopes are also eroding slopes, and soil is also saturated, so ready for any kind of a landslide or a sudden flash floods. So when soil is heavily saturated, even a low intensity rainfall can easily trigger the landslides or a floods in these steep slopes. We all knew that Himalayas are the youngest folding mountains. So therefore, being young, they are geologically weak, and they are also highly prone to the earthquakes because Himalayas are the result of Indian plates collision with the Eurasian plate. So therefore, they are tectonically active and they are also earthquake prone. So therefore, they are inherently more vulnerable compared to the older ranges such as Aravalis. So Aravalis are much more older compared to the Himalayas. So further to this natural fragility, large scale construction and heavy vehicular traffic, so they further heighten the risk during the extreme rainfall events. So apart from that, there are other causes also, such as urbanization, commercial activities, developmental projects, and even the hydroelectricity projects, human settlements, shifting cultivation, unscientific agricultural practices, deforestation. So all these factors are responsible for such flash floods and landslides in Himalayan areas. So therefore, developmental activities needs to be regulated. Environmental impact assessment must be conducted. And apart from that, the Himalayan zones should be divided into the entire Himalayan area should be divided into multiple zones based on their vulnerability. And afforestation should be done on a large scale. And apart from that, there is a need to prevent human settlements in these fragile areas, right? So all these factors, all the combination of these factors are the need of the hour. And apart from that, the early warning system and the mitigation action plan, so all these things are necessary to reduce the vulnerability of people who are living in these areas, right? So I hope you have understood this topic. And the next important topic, we all knew that United States of America President Donald Trump has imposed 50% tariffs on India. So initially he imposed 25% tariffs, and additionally he again imposed 25% more tariffs on Indian goods which are exported to US. So total tariffs reached to 50%. So let's understand, so what is the impact of US tariffs on Indian goods and how it is going to impact India's trade with US and also India's relations with the United States, and how India can cope up with such tariffs. So let's understand this, because we have already discussed about these topics, right? So they are very important for both prelims and mains examination. So let's try and discuss these topics. So we all knew that US has imposed an additional tariff of 25% on Indian imports. And in fact, the reason that US has given for increasing tariffs on Indian goods is that India has been continuously importing Russian oil, which is a key source of Russia's war efforts against Ukraine. So therefore, this is the reason that why we are imposing 50% tariffs on Indian goods, so that India would stop purchasing Russian oil, and that would stop fueling the war machinery of Russia against Ukraine. So it shows the hypocrisy of United States of America, because the United States of America itself imports uranium and fertilizer from Russia, and several European countries still import LNG from Russia. So despite that, US President Donald Trump has imposed highest tariffs on India. Even China has also been importing Russian oil more than India. Still then, Trump has imposed at least 50% tariffs on Indian exports to US. It is higher than China's US tariffs on China. However, so when Donald Trump imposed 50% tariffs on the Indian goods which are exported to US, so India condemned this move as unjust, unfair and unreasonable. However, Experts also warn that it could reduce India's annual GDP by around 0.5 percentage points as well. So therefore it is going to have a huge economic implication for India as well. Now, what are the Trump's reasons for targeting India with a higher tariffs? So let's understand some reasons that the Donald Trump has given. And in fact, so officially citing India's energy imports from Russia, so additional tariffs appear aimed at increasing pressure on India signing a US favorable trade deal. So we all knew that US and India are in the negotiating phase when it comes to a trade deal. So therefore US as of now has given the reason that India has been importing Russian oil, but the real reason could be increasing pressure on India into signing a trade deal which favors US more. See, you have to understand one thing, that if you look at India and US trade, now India is US is the second largest trading partner for India after China. With China we have a trade deficit, but with US we have a trade surplus. So therefore US wanted to reduce this trade margin, and therefore US has been negotiating a US favored trade deal with India, right? So this move is seen as, or appeared as, aimed to increase pressure on India to sign a US favorable trade deal. However, Trump has been long labeled India as one of the most protectionist nations. So what does it mean, most protectionist nations? So in case if USA wanted to export its goods to India, so USA's goods need to pay tariffs, right? So USA's goods need to pay tariffs before entering into the Indian market. So this has been done to protect Indian domestic manufacturing sector, right? So therefore, which is called as a protectionist tendency. In order to protect our domestic industries, what we are doing, we are increasing tariffs on goods which are imported from other countries. So therefore US, particularly Donald Trump, very often labeling India as a protectionist nation with a high trade and non-trade barriers, thereby limiting the foreign market access to the American goods into India. However, he argues that these barriers enable India to maintain a trade surplus with US. So remember, as I've already told you, that India enjoying a huge trade surplus with US. But US President Donald Trump claims that the trade and non-trade barriers imposed by India on US goods helped India maintain a huge surplus with US, meaning India exports more than US. Then so what is the meaning of trade surplus? So if I say that India has been enjoying trade surplus with the US goods, so that essentially means that India exporting more than what it is importing to US. It is exporting more rather than importing goods from US. So that is so this is how Trump weaponized the trade. So if Trump imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods, so that will help substantially reduce the gap, right? So the substantially reduce the trade deficit of US with India, right? So therefore Trump's broader goal is to reduce trade deficit, and also he wanted to establish what he considered a balanced trade relations with India. However, Trump's notions are not rooted in promoting free trade but achieving a balanced trade, meaning zero trade deficit with India, which may not be possible. However, the balanced trade between two countries rarely occurs naturally, as nations typically have deficit with some partners and surpluses with the others. So that is why I have already said that it is not possible to achieve the balanced trade, means zero trade deficit. However, What actually matters is avoiding the overall trade deficit that becomes unsustainable, where imports significantly exceed countries' capacity to pay for the imports. Now, in this context, let's understand the impact of tariffs on reducing trade deficit. So, how increasing tariffs on Indian goods entering into US market will reduce the trade deficit of US with India. So, what is a trade deficit? I am explaining this again. Trade deficit actually means you are exporting more, you are importing more than what you export. So in this case, US is having a trade deficit with India. That means US imports more goods than it exports to India. So therefore, a tariff of 50% can act as a tax on imported goods. So therefore, it makes costlier for the domestic consumers. So in case if Trump imposes 50% tariffs on Indian goods which are exported to US markets, so increasing tariffs actually means that the American consumers will have to pay higher prices for those items. And in fact, with 50% tariff on Indian goods, so US buyers will find these products significantly more expensive. So therefore, there will be lesser demand for Indian goods in the American markets because of the higher tariffs. So that indirectly means that Indian goods are not competitive in the US market. And in fact, they may switch to cheaper alternatives from other countries, or they may avoid purchasing the product altogether. And in fact, as imports from India decline, while US exports to India remain unchanged, the US trade deficit with India will narrow and could eventually be eliminated. Right? So therefore, it has been indicating that the imports from India would decline because there will be lesser demand for Indian goods if US continues to import continues to impose 50% tariffs on Indian goods. So it leads to declining Indian exports to US. Then US exports to India remain unchanged or same. So therefore, the trade deficit with India will come down and could eventually be eliminated. So this is what the plan of US. So they wanted to reduce the trade deficit with India. And in fact, US President Donald Trump also using tariffs as a tool to push for a better trade deal with other countries as well. So apart from reducing the imports, tariffs are being used to pressure India to trade into a trade deal which is aimed at eliminating the trade deficit. So they wanted to altogether eliminate the trade deficit and also wanted to have a favorable trade deal for the US through such tariffs on Indian goods. However, this can be achieved by compelling India to open its domestic markets to more US goods, thereby boosting US exports, or by urging the Indian government and related entities to purchase more American products such as defense equipment, crude oil, directly contributing to the narrowing trade deficit. Right? So let's understand why retaliatory tariffs may backfire for India. So we all knew that US has imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods. So what if India imposed tariffs on US goods which are exported to Indian markets? So they are actually called as the retaliatory tariffs. So since USA has imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods, so we will also impose 50% tariffs on the US goods which are entering into Indian markets. They are called as the retaliatory tariffs. However, experts warn that these retaliatory tariffs may backfire for India because imposing tariffs on US imports would hurt Indian consumers because it will significantly increase the cost of US products in India, and it will further reduce imports from US as well. So therefore, it could further widen India's trade deficit, prompting further US tariffs, since Trump's primary goal is to eliminate the deficit that US actually has with India. Now let's understand the impact of US tariffs on Indian economy and jobs. So according to experts, the US tariffs on Indian goods would affect at least 2% of India's GDP. Right? So while tariffs are imposed between the governments, the real effect hits the companies, workers, and the consumers. Thereby, they will ultimately disrupt the supply chain as well. Tariffs also lead to closure of companies and the job losses as well. At this point of time, India cannot afford job losses and closure of the companies. So therefore, Indian exports, particularly the labor intensive sectors such as textiles, carpets, food products, so they may lose contracts to competitors in untariffed countries, thereby causing job losses and even the livelihood disruptions as well. However, the deeper impact lies less in GDP decline and more in employment devastation, because it reduces the demand for Indian goods in US markets, and thereby it leads to the reduced production of goods, and reduced production of goods means job losses. So therefore ultimately it leads to the employment devastation in the Indian economy, right? So I hope you have understood this. So next important topic is understand the strategic importance of Strait of Dardanelles. Now this Strait of Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits are two important straits in Middle East, and they are very important. And you can see here that this is the Strait of Dardanelles, and this Strait of Dardanelles links Sea of Marmara with Aegean Sea. Right, so this is Bosphorus Strait, and this Bosphorus Strait links Black Sea with Sea of Marmara. So now we'll try to understand the significance and importance of the Strait of Dardanelles, which link Sea of Marmara with the Aegean Sea. Now why it is in news? Now you can see here it is Turkey. Turkey actually controls both a Strait of Bosphorus as well as Dardanelles Strait. Now Turkey recently closed the Dardanelles Strait to shipping traffic due to the forest fires in the surrounding areas. So forest fires in the surrounding areas triggered the closure of the Dardanelles Strait. So therefore it actually highlights the importance of Strait of Dardanelles in global maritime navigation and regional security as well. Now ultimately the Mediterranean Sea is linked with the Black Sea through the Dardanelles Strait, Sea of Marmara, Bosphorus Strait, and then ultimately to Black Sea. Right, so therefore it is strategically very, very important for global maritime navigation and for regional security as well. So let's understand the closure of the Strait of Dardanelles as well as its strategic significance. Now we all knew, because of the forest fires that took place in the surrounding areas, Turkey closed the shipping traffic through the Dardanelles Strait. And in fact, the Dardanelles Strait is considered as a key maritime route for vessels which connect the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. So this is Aegean Sea, this is Dardanelles Strait, Sea of Marmara and Bosphorus Strait, and then the Black Sea. So therefore the closure actually impacts the international trade routes, particularly countries which are dependent on Black Sea access. And in fact, the Dardanelles Strait actually plays a strategic role in both commercial shipping and military navigation as well. And historically, the Strait of Dardanelles is significant in World War I's Gallipoli campaign and other regional conflicts as well. So its location is very important. So just try and understand its location. So you just have to remember this. So if we talk about the geopolitical and economic importance of Strait of Dardanelles, it serves as a maritime choke point for Black Sea nations like Russia, Ukraine and Bulgaria. And it even controls grains, shipping, oil, energy shipments from the Black Sea into the rest of the global markets. However, the Montreux Convention 1936, it regulates the passage of warships through the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits. However, any closure or restriction, it could further trigger global shipping delays and even the economic disruptions as well. Now in this case, because of the forest fires, Turkey closed this Strait of Dardanelles, and that might cause the global shipping delays and even economic disruptions as well. The Strait of Dardanelles is also essential for NATO's naval strategy and regional maritime security. So let's understand some key and important facts with respect to the Dardanelles Strait. Its location: it is located northwestern part of Turkey, separating Europe from Asia Minor. Its length is 61 kilometers, its width is 1.2 to 6.5 kilometers, making it one of the narrowest straits used for international navigation. So as I've already told you, that it links the Aegean Sea with Sea of Marmara, and the Bosphorus Strait connects the Sea of Marmara with the Black Sea. Right, so this is all about the Dardanelles Strait and the Bosphorus Strait and Sea of Marmara. So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.